Up next, we have Kelly Forsythe from the Wild Animal Initiative. Over to you, Kelly, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, everyone. So, hello. Well, actually, first, before I get started, unfortunately, my upstairs neighbor is drilling, so I apologize for any background noise that you might hear. I'm going to do my best anyway. But thank you for joining me for the talk today. So I'm Kelly Forsythe. I'm the current grants coordinator at the Wild Animal Initiative Grants Program. And the grants manager, Luke, is also going to be giving you guys a talk tomorrow at 11:15. So if you're interested in hearing what Luke has to say, feel free to join in for that session as well. But just as a brief introduction, for those of you that aren't familiar with Wild Animal Initiative, we're an organization dedicated to furthering the field of wild animal welfare through research, grants, and outreach programs. But more information can be found on our website, which is wildanimalininitiative.org. So just quickly going through the topics that I'm going to try to cover today. Firstly, defining how what we think are wild animals, why we think it's important to focus on neglected / underrepresented species, expanding on the current funding landscape, and the opportunities that we are presenting to researchers, our definition of wild animal welfare, and a brief overview of our grants program and the types of projects that we offer, what criteria we look for when assessing applications, and what avenue you would need to take if you were going to apply. And then we have a final Q&A session. So I'm sure that given the nature of this symposium, that a lot of you in attendance are likely to already have an understanding of the phrase wild animal. However, seeing as we're speaking about wild animals in the context of our grants program, I thought it would be useful to define what we mean. So it's important to note that we, Wild Animal Initiative, speak about wild animals that are animals judged on an individual basis rather than looking at the overall species. So this would be animals that are living out with human control, but could be living in human-dominated environments, for example, in parks or urban spaces. And this would include things like pigeons, hedgehogs, and even your pollinators. Our organization is solely focused on wild animals and therefore does not include animals that would be considered as pets, those farmed animals in captivity, in zoos or labs, regardless of their species. So now that I hope I've provided you with an understanding of what we would classify as a wild animal, it's time to move on to consider the role of neglectedness and how this plays a part in the species that we support. So one of the main categories in our applications that are what they're assessed against is this idea of neglectedness. This looks at the overall number of individual animals and focuses on those that may be abundant, common, and or underrepresented, and may not otherwise be able to secure funding. The idea behind this is that we're trying to support as many animals that we're able to and fill the funding gap for those species that would not qualify for support from traditional conservation funders. This translates to not only the total number of animals the project is looking at helping, but also how transferable the findings of these projects would be, and whether this could be applied to other species and or taxa. I'm sure as many of you probably are aware that securing funding for research projects is difficult and also extremely competitive. And this is particularly the case when it comes to wild animal welfare science. So if you cast your mind back to the definition that I provided of wild animals, when we consider the number of wild animals in the world and then compare them against others in the non-human population, i.e. farmed, they make up the majority. Despite making up the majority, there is arguably too little funding for wild animal welfare science, or at least in our understanding of wild animal welfare, which I'll define in the next slide. The reasoning behind our grants program is therefore twofold. One, it aims to deepen scientific understanding, and two, create a community of researchers that are supported at all stages of their career. So now that we've outlined the funding landscape, let's move on to talk about wild animal welfare and how this relates to the 5 domains model. So firstly, you'll see our definition here, outlining that we at Y focus on what can be defined as the quality of an individual's subjective experiences, with subjective experiences meaning good or bad feelings. This ultimately fits within the wider 5 domains model, which focuses on the affective state of an individual. The 4 outside domains therefore feed into an individual's experience, with welfare being determined as the quality of these experiences. So now moving on to our grants program itself. This overview provides an inside look at how it's run in the past couple of rounds, but please do note that the latest information can be found on our website, and we're trying to improve things as we go along, so this may change on a round-by-round basis. So first up, we have our seed grants that support pilot projects, and these pilot projects aim at testing new techniques and/or approaches to further the field of wild animal welfare science. These are usually aimed at our early career researchers or those that are further along in their career, but don't actually have a significant experience in wild animal welfare science. They're usually between 2,000 and 30,000 US dollars and last up to 2 years. Next up, we have our challenge grants. These could be considered as our flagship projects, and these are larger. So we're looking at up to 200K over 5 years. These could be, these actually are aiming at exploring critical research questions and are most likely led by an experienced principal investigator. And last but not least, we have our fellowship program. And this offers an opportunity for postdocs to gain insight and experience in wild animal welfare science whilst receiving monitoring and support. Fellowships can be up to 60K annually and last up to 3 years, and include the guidance of a wild animal initiative mentor, as well as being a part of not just the fellowship community, but also our wider grantee community as well. So moving on to the key selection criteria. All of our projects are assessed against the selection criteria outlined on this slide. While I won't be boring you to death and delving into all of these in great detail, I'll run through them quickly. Of course, if you have any additional questions on any of this, Luke and myself are available after this presentation and also after this workshop, if you have any specific questions on an application you'd like to submit. So first, we have scope, but I guess we also have neglectedness. I've briefly touched on these earlier in the presentation, but essentially we want to support projects that are looking to benefit as many underrepresented animals as possible, but also with transferable results. Up next, we have impact, the ability of your project to further the knowledge in the field. We also take into consideration engagement, which has been spoken about in various forms already. So this is the likelihood of your project to inspire or support future research and or policy changes. Of course, we know that they're important too. We have feasibility. So how likely are you to deliver what you say you will? Research ethics, so whether there is any harm that is likely to be the result of your project to either humans and animals. And last but not least, we have cost effectiveness. So does your project actually represent value for money? So before we go into the actual application process, we've outlined some of the practical guidelines we look for in a proposal. So first, a clearly testable hypothesis. a focus on welfare rather than species conservation, a solid and robust methodology, indicators based on evidence, and ideally projects that aim to do as little harm to no harm to animals as possible. So if all of this sounds of interest to you, I'm going to quickly run through the application process. So in this section, I'll be breaking down the three main stages of your application, starting with the first stage, which is the expression of interest. We ask for a brief summary here of your proposed future project. You obviously don't need to convince us that this is a perfect project. They don't exist. Only that the project is highly relevant to wild animal welfare and competitive within the scope of the call for proposals. So during this stage, we'll be identifying projects that are likely to be competitive and follow the key criteria, so impact, scope, and neglectedness. The next stage is the full proposal. So as part of your application, you'll need to submit a literature review. You'll be required to outline your objectives and activities, as well as a timeline, so outlining when these activities will be taking place. A full budget broken down by year, a detailed description of the methodology and any necessary ethical considerations, and an explanation as to how your project contributes to the field of wild animal welfare. And the third and final stage is the decision-making stage. So you'll be expected to provide clarifications and consider modifications based on the feedback you'll have received from our reviewers. Just as a note, we don't have any current calls for proposals open just now, but we hope to launch our seed grants later in the summer, so keep a lookout for that. And excitingly, this round of our seed grants will not be restricted to any themes, but you'll see that we've highlighted some topics, some relevant areas on the screen there. And if you're interested in applying, please do head over to our website, which is on your screen as well, or get in touch with Luke or myself, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly, for a very clear talk and also sticking to time. There are a couple of questions. Before I'll ask a more basic question, actually. First, of course, everyone is happy to see more opportunities for funding. And I think the Wild Animal Initiative is fantastic. How did it get started suddenly? Because it was basically a big gap before and there was no funding available. So what were the origins of the Wild Animal Initiative?
That's a very good question, and I'll be honest, I'm not that well versed in the complete history of the organization, but it did start from a previous organization about 3 years ago, I'd say, and we kind of span off and created our grants program as well, which sort of aims to use the funding that we do have to kind of bolster this, I guess, sector, and we're looking to continue to grow.
There are multiple questions in chat. We are not going to have time for all of them. I'm going to pick one from Sarah Bonser-Blake. Just out of, well, first of all, thanks for your talk. Just out of interest, what is your policy on wild animals which come into captivity for a short amount of time before being re-released, for example, rescue animals?
So I would say that your project is likely to be eligible, but it's important to note how this would then be, if it would be transferable to a wild context. So if you could make that clear in your application, we would likely fund it.
Okay. Thank you very much. There are other questions, and I would ask you, Kelly, if you don't mind, to answer them in chat so that we can stick to time. And there's been lots of chat and discussion already. So Matt and I are done for chairing for now, and we are going to hand over to Elodie in Copenhagen and Tamara in Chile.